Okay, briefly here, there are 4 amendments, okay, that we're going to discuss today. We're going to break this down. Maureen is going to handle the majority of them because they're financial in nature. And we will have, and I will handle the community-wide voting, which is the last amendment in the program today. We will have questions after each segment. You don't have to remember and remind yourself, okay, what the question was before the very end. We will take questions after each amendment is explained. So, and Gary is here. Okay, I think we can start, right? The first slide, put the first slide up, please. Let's see if. There it is. Okay, those here, this is the committee we've been working on. Well, about a month or two, I should say about that. Proposal number 1 is about special assessments. And that's 1.
Unless anyone has an objection, I'm going to stay seated. So if you can't hear me or can't want to see me, I'll stand up, but otherwise I'm going to stay here to be here. Okay. Proposed amendment 1 has to do with section 7.11 special assessment. And I see most leaking through your pamphlets already, so you know the reason for the recommending this amendment is because catastrophes cannot be predicted. We can't budget ahead of time for catastrophes. So this is an effort to make it easier for the board to be able to deal with a catastrophic storm and or storms if and when they happen. I'm not used to this. Okay. This, I will not read this. I'm not going to read, obviously it's long and you've probably all read it already, but the pertinent parts are underlined in blue. That the way that amendment or the way that 711 is structured right now, the board has the authority to assess up to $200 to special assessment in any 1 year without going for a membership vote. This stays the same, but it is going to exclude named storms. So then that is covered in the language on the bottom. Special assessments for the repair of damages caused by a named storm shall not exceed $200 per parcel per named storm unless approved in advance by a majority of the members who are eligible to vote and present in person or by proxy at a duly called meeting of the members. So that is the actual language that will be on your ballot that you will be voting on, exactly as you see it there. So here's some background on why this amendment was proposed. We, in the past year, nominated someone who has an extensive background in insurance. His entire career was insurance. Joe Morak is his name. And he conducted a review of all Heritage Bay insurance policies. And he came back to the finance committee and expressed his big concern if we have more than one named storm in a year. I think most of us can agree that the climate has gotten a little bit more unpredictable. We're seeing a lot more odd weather, catastrophic weather. And he was concerned that the way our documents are written, it might put us in financial straits if the board did not have this ability to assess $200 per named storm. So that's the genesis of this amendment. And as you can see that our deductible for each named storm right now is over $1 million, close to 1.5 million. So that's a pretty hefty deductible. And other background, we have only had one assessment, special assessment, I should say, the club, and that was for Irma back in 2017 to repair damages from that. Okay, the thing to remember about this amendment is that this is not automatic. If we have a named storm that comes through Naples and it doesn't do any damage to our club, that's null and void. This has to be for actual damages incurred at the club. So just because a named storm comes through Naples does not mean that the board is going to have an assessment. So it gives them the ability, if we suffer damage, and the board feels, and along with management and the controller, that whatever damages cannot be absorbed by the current budget, then it gives the board a little leeway, and the board can go ahead and make that assessment. And one of the reasons I would say that the wisdom behind that is it takes a while to put together a membership vote, and it also costs money. I think I've heard the cost for our membership votes tend to be maybe 8,000 to 10,000 because of all the communications and things that need to be, all the rules that need to be followed. So number one, it's expensive to have to go to a membership vote. And number two, it's more time consuming. And I'm just thinking, you know, after a hurricane, tradespeople are at a premium. And if we could get our special assessment in and get some money in hand and get the tradespeople before everybody else, we'll be in a better shape than some other communities that are going to be waiting for months and months for some of these tradespeople. So the next point is the amount assessed. I think I pretty much already covered this. It's not automatically going to be 200. If the board determines that there have been damages that cannot be absorbed by the budget, they can assess up to $200 if the damages are that much, but that is not a mandatory. They could decide that the club would be fine with just assessing $100 or $50, but it has to be based on the actual amount of damages. So I think that's the background that I have. Now I'll open it up for any questions about this amendment. Yes.
What does it say for parcel? What is parcel?
Well, we have 1,250 doors. I think that's probably the legal term that's in our bylaws, but it's basically each member, each door. We have here 1,250 doors. Well, it's the real estate that each member owns, which is your unit. If you own more than one, then obviously, you know, just like your regular annual assessment, you would get 2 assessments if you own 2 verandas or 2 terraces or whatever. Yes.
So Maureen, your assessment of this is that special assessment would be earmarked specifically and only for damages.
Correct.
It's not quite just for the repair of damages. I guess I'd like to ensure that it can't go anywhere else.
I think if you read the actual governing document as it's written, it's specified. We didn't go into every word of this.
Well, she is correct. That's what it says for the repair of damages. But if the club tried to, or the board tried to apply it to some other use, I think every member would have a point of contention that specifically says for the repair of damages.
Maureen, obviously, from the time that's assessed, in the case of a named storm, until it's collected, we've got lag time, and contractors are a premium in that kind of situation. Do our covenants provide us the authority to borrow from another source until those funds come in and are paid? So we can pay the contractors promptly and get them on schedule?
Our documents, I know we can't borrow a certain, I thought it was, somebody else help me out, 300,000 without a membership vote? Is that?
For the purposes of this assessment, as long as we have funds for you, if, let's say it's the middle of the year, we still have your assessments that sit there all year long and operating costs come out. So Lena is able to make sure that the funds are available.
So we can float those funds over, fill the void, until the discharge.
In a perfect world, they typically.
Okay. All right.
Oh, sorry, I thought you meant borrow from a bank. I didn't
No, I
know you
meant
meant borrow from our own
Wonderful.
funds. Okay, sorry about that. My fault. Yes,
We had a special assessment for Irma.
yes.
Can you have that number, what it was?
It was $200.
It was the $200.
Yeah, and a lot of people who live, I think, in the verandas and terraces and possibly coach homes, I think they are able to get that back from their own insurance company. Somebody, I'm in single family, so I'm not sure, but I think I've heard that from people that you can then get reimbursed from your own homeowner's
Depending
insurance.
on what it was for.
Yeah,
Yeah, if you're in a condo, the condo, law requires your insurance to cover those special assessments for hurricane and stuff. That you really have to look at your own policy to make sure that it's in.
I'm not sure. I think homeowner or single family homes, I don't think it's a blanket. I think it's- Right,
Yeah, that was for Irma, and it was, March of 2018, I think, actually, when it was set up. In fact, most people hate me because that was the first thing I did as treasurer that year was give you all an assessment. Nobody liked that.
I believe I paid.
I'm hoping everybody did, because we did fix everything else. And if you compare it to the notes at that time, Irma, our assessment was a lot less than the one I'm getting closing on.
yes.
I think a lot of people don't realize sometimes that the majority of the damage would be from lakes. And you'd get an assessment from CDD for that. I think that's the bigger expense.
Damage to the lakes or from the lakes?
From the lakes to the lakes, the banks, they did a lot of work on the banks after,
The assessment from Heritage Bay, from Irma, was damage to landscaping and golf course,
but there
and
was
signs. There was a lot of, but that we didn't have for the most recent one, so you never know. This was, the more recent hurricane was the more damaging storm, but we had a lot less damage for Heritage Bay.
Dick, correct me if I'm wrong, I think the CBD did go out and rebond for damage to Irma. That's why here you have a CDD that handles the images, which is as part of their realm, is damages to lakes. And we did rebuild all our lakes out on Siesta Bay and on Biscayne Bay. Those lakes were re-stoned, and actually re-terraced and everything. But that was all covered under the CDD. Had that not been, then the association responsible, that assessment would have been well over $200.
Any other questions about this specific amendment? Okay, thank you. Moving on. Okay, I will also be handling the next amendment, which actually are three different amendments. We're lumping them together because they are all part of section 8.4 maintenance and alteration. So there are three different amendments, and you will be voting on each one separately, but when you see them on your ballot, they will all be, it's all one big paragraph, and it's color coded based on the different. So we can move along to the. So that's just basically what it is. So the next slide is reason for proposed amendment 2A, and I would call this basically cleaning up the document. This is something that was, I guess, discovered, maybe other people knew about it, but when we went to make amendments to the section, it was found that there were a couple terms that are not defined in our documents, specifically flood community common areas and Gulf common areas. Those are not defined in our documents. What is defined is flood common areas. So it makes sense to make this change now, since we're going to be amending the documents anyway. We don't want to have vague and undefined language in our documents. We need to have everything defined. So that's what this does. It takes out undefined language and keeps to language that is already defined in the documents. Okay, the next one is, I'm guessing, the reason why you all came. And this is a amendment to increase the amount of money that the board can spend on an annual capital expenditure budget. It has been, right now, that cap is 300,000, and it's been that way since when I turned over to community. And if you look at the chart, which I know is in like 4-point type, but put on your readers, and you can see that inflation over the past 10 years has changed that, what was purchasing power of 300,000 to 2012, now it costs over 380,000. And that was as of last year, and inflation is still going up. So we've lost purchasing power in our capital expenditure budget. So that is the main reason that that is proposed. Okay, and moving along to Amendment C, this ties in but can still be voted on separately, which is, it's proposing giving the board by resolution, but it would have to be a vote, giving the board the opportunity to annually increase the the capital expenditure budget by tying it to any increase in the consumer price index, the annual CPI. So it wouldn't be automatic, it would have to be by board resolution. So moving on to advance one more slide. No. Okay, yeah, I'm not going to read all of this, but I just want you to see how this is going to look on your ballot. It's very nicely color coded, so you can see which parts apply to the First Amendment 2A, and those are highlighted in yellow. The things that are highlighted in green, which is just the one, is for Amendment 2B, and then the things highlighted in blue are applied to Amendment 2C. So I won't read this paragraph, but I'm sure we'll all of them have. Okay, yeah. Okay, so here's a little background on this amendment. The capital budget is for items that don't currently exist at Heritage Bay. We have a reserve fund that is for replacement and repairs and things like that when we need to, say, put down new carpeting because this gets spotted with red wine stains or whatever. That would be a reserve item because that carpet already exists here. But things that don't exist here, for instance, the new wall, terrace wall that they just put in along the tar path, that did not exist before, so that was a capital item. So that's what the capital budget is for, things that do not exist currently at Heritage Bay and are not covered, the things that aren't covered under our reserve fund. Okay, now this is still part of the same slide. All right, the past 2 years, the board has not voted to assess anything from the members for the capital budget because one way that we do collect money for our capital budget is through a mechanism called the resale capital contribution fee. And if someone sells their house in Heritage Bay, the club assesses a $5,000, well, it's now $5,000 fee, it hasn't always been. And this amount goes into the capital fund, okay? So we have, because you all know how crazy real estate got after the pandemic and during the pandemic, we were able to amass enough in that capital fund that the board for the past 2 years has not assessed the members for any capital expenditures. Okay, next slide. And the years before that, in case you're wondering, were the years of the HBEP, the Heritage Bay Expansion Project. So the capital fund during that time of the building, the capital fund was dedicated towards the HBEP because that was all new capital. When it wasn't part of the HBEP, historically the capital expenditure budget comprises, say, 10 to 12 things. This year, and for 2023, it's a shorter list, we only got 6 items, but historically, it's been 10 to 12 items. Some of the things that have been purchased before, you can see the camera sitting up there, so we can have a nice Zoom meeting for members who can't be here in person. They got a sound system for when they have golf events, so the head pro can, you know, speak to the group and everybody can hear them. What else? The new awnings for the, in between the kind of stadium court 1 and for the pickleball. Those were some capital items. So There usually, also usually a lot of, golf course maintenance equipment. There's always some new piece that's needed. So that's usually what the capital budget entails, is usually a number of different items. So the next point is, I pretty much already made that, that inflation has eaten away at the board's ability to, keep up in terms of investment, which, I don't think I made that point, but I'll make the point that one of the presenters, that we've had various strategic workshops over the years, and one of the presenters made the point that if you stay static and you don't make investments in your community, you're basically going to fall behind, because everybody is making investments. Meaning all the other clubs in Southwest Florida are constantly making investments and improvements. And so if we stay static, by default, we fall behind. So the only other point I'd make on that slide is that inflation is still predicted to be 3.2 for 2023. So that's if we took that 80,000 and added another 3.2%. Somebody do the math really quickly, but I'm sure we'll probably at least get 400,000. Okay, next slide, please. All right, I already talked about how the resale capital contribution fee, but the point I wanted to make about this slide is that when someone buys into Heritage Bay and they have to pay this fee, I think it's almost like a contractor promise that Heritage Bay is making to that person is asking for that $5,000. They're saying, we want this money so we can put it in our capital fund. And to me, it's almost implicit that that money will be used for capital improvements. And so when you keep decreasing the purchasing power, but yet you're still asking people to contribute to the capital fund, it's a little bit out of whack. That we're making the promise that we're going to keep investing in our community. We're going to keep our standards high, the way our mission and vision statements say. But yet, the amount that we can invest every year has relatively gone down based on, the current dollars. So that was that slide. Next one. Okay, and kind of along with the point I made for the storm assessment, the board is not obligated to use the entire 400,000 if that is voted in every year. There might be years where, for some reason Kevin has all the golf course equipment that he needs, or tennis hasn't been asking for any big projects. So that's not that it's going to every single year have to be 400,000, but it's raising the limit so the board has that possibility. And again, I'll make the point that the board has not assessed for the capital, made a capital assessment for the past 2 years. We have been able to use the amount collected through the capital resale contribution fee. So again, even if they do allocate the entire 400,000, that doesn't mean that's automatically coming out of your pocket. And then finally, the last bullet point has to do with, oh no, that's not, one more. But I'll make this point first, that Amendment 2C simply gives the board, as I said before, the opportunity to take a vote, pass a resolution to increase the capital budget tied into the annual CPI. So it's not a given, but it gives the board that opportunity. It makes it so we don't have to come back every 10 years or 5 years and try to catch up with inflation. And final slide is, I've had several people ask me or say to me or hint or intimate that they think this is an end run around to be able to construct new pickleball courts without going back for a membership vote. And that was not at all the topic of discussion when the finance committee discussed this. That's a rumor. That's not the genesis of this amendment. And I think that's the last one. Next slide is questions. So I know I went a little fast. Sorry if I was not quite coherent, but Any questions? Oh, all right, go ahead.
Can you tell me, when have we ever reached that 300,000 plateau in a year?
Well, last year we came really, really close. I think our, budget was like 299,000.
Oh, last year.
Yeah.
And that was as close as we've ever came, or?
Well, I've only been treasurer for 2 years, so my historical knowledge on that, I don't go back to, I have to look at past budgets to tell you that.
There's a correlation between 2A and 2B. I think, at least I was confused by it. On 2A, you update the terminology common ground. But then also when it says that it removes authority for 300,000. If the first one is approved and the second one, which changes the 300 to 400, is not approved, you're going to be left without no monies between the two.
What I
A
think,
takes out 300 if it's approved. B, if it's not approved, you don't have 300, you don't have anything left.
no,
The way the wording is currently in the proposal.
the first one would take out community. So it would still say there shall be no material alteration of or substantial additions to the club common areas costing more than 400,000 in the aggregate, blah, 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 blah. So all that did on that sentence was take out the word community. And then the one at the bottom that you're talking about is taking out the ability to, make substantial additions to golf common areas of 300,000, but that's not a defined term.
Okay, in your wording, they'll say remove 300,000.
Okay, so if you look at the, existing, if you look at the existing, you look at the existing documents, Bob, there's 300,000 for capital and there's another 300,000 for golf capital. Which it's the golf capital that's coming out. So we're just saying we want to raise the existing 300 for general capital improvements, 400,000, so we can catch
You
up.
only talk about capital improvement.
Yes.
You don't specify that in your, and leave in. Your second part, we need on part B. In both your frequent asked questions and also in your wording, you mentioned the word inflation many times. I think most of the people, I say a considerable number of the people in this audience has been greatly affected by inflation, gas prices, the price of eggs, etc. So individually, what do? We look at our budget, we look at what we have to spend, and then we make corrections. We don't have the ability to change that inflation other than to handle internally what we need to do to account for inflation. You mentioned, Maureen, in your example, it's not in any of this literature about the ability to put money into better interest-bearing bonds from the treasury. You know, that offsets it. But here, you're asking nothing for 400,000 other than for inflation, where the rest of us have to manage inflation internally. So why can we approve 400,000?
The answer I would have,
That the board is not mentioned. I'll get them.
the answer I would have to that is, I don't know if you and your family set up a mission and vision statement, but our club does have a mission and vision statement that we strive to be among the best of the bundled clubs in Southwest Florida. And to do that, we have to invest in the club. That's just the bottom line.
But you don't have to ask for additional money without plans around it. I think this is just a money grab for going ahead and asking for additional money to go ahead. And in part C, you talk about, and the word always is in both the revision and in the additional statement, you say annual increases are tied to the CPI. Why don't you just put in there change? Why do you have to mention annual increases? You know, we could go into a recession and the CPI could almost impossibly fall. But here you always say annual increases. Why not just use the word changes without always emphasizing adding additional money in asking the members to fund that.
I think it's probably too late to make that change, haven't, I don't know, somebody else help me out on that.
But you're stating always it's going to be annual.
Where's the word always? I was trying to see that.
But also, Bob, we're not required to spend $100,000 more just because we're upping it. That's just,
Annual increases of the capital expenditure.
okay, so right now we have
It
three.
It could be,
Where's the word always?
Right
though?
now,
You said the word always.
right now, we have $300,000 that we're authorized to spend for capital. And in the 2023 budget, we're spending about 150,000.
140,000.
So just because the documents say that we can spend up to 300,000, that doesn't mean that we're going to. So, you know, the wording is that if there are enough capital projects that need to be done, and that the membership generally wants to be done because we want our community to be up to date, that we don't have to go to a member vote to do that. That's all.
assumption.
Well, what do you say? I mean, I will reiterate the point that for the past 2 years, the board has not assessed members for this portion of the capital budget. This is kind of, I'll say it again, a contract with the people who have paid that capital resale contribution fee. We've told them it's going to be dedicated for capital improvements.
That's why it's increased year to year to year.
Okay, so why do you have so it's coming from that fund? I guess I'm questioning why you are opposed to that when it's basically the fee has been collected from other people and it's a kind of a promise to those people, we're going to keep investing in this club and keep our high standards. Why does that bother you? It's not coming out of your pocket.
It's not coming out of our pocket.
Not coming out, the past 2 years, it hasn't come out of your pocket.
Because we had that good capital increase by the new buyers paying the fee that was raised 3 times.
Right, but that's not coming from you.
We don't have to pay it. Now, home sales are, going in the tank. They're going the opposite direction. Any
Right.
additional improvement you may look at, could be just now. The 3 cents I get from the realtors here and the engineers here.
Last year, we exceeded our, we're getting the signal to wrap this up. Okay, last year, we did exceed by far the budgeted number of resale capital contribution fees. Yes, go ahead.
Just a quick question, so I have kind of a description of definition of what you're gonna be increasing on the CPI. When you've gone from last, and I couldn't see, and I didn't get a chance to read this, but, first of all, I'm for all what you're doing here, I think it's a great idea. With the CPI or the inflation you've seen, most of the inflation has been over a couple of years, most in the past 10 years or so, it's been very, very small. Are we taking the inflation amount or this over that 10-year period or the last 5 years, or what is it? And then are we trying to get to that 400 grand now, or are we just saying that from here on in, it will be this number, that that's what we adjusted to? Where's that?
And what you just said, your second statement, from here on in, we are proposing 400,000 with the option for the board by resolution to vote to increase it in subsequent years commensurate with the CPI, if there is a CPI increase.
So the CPI will go up, that amount will go up in any CapEx going.
If the board by resolution takes that action, yes.
How did we get from 300 to 400? Was that, where's that?
In that little chart that's very small print.
Yeah,
Well, Lena basically went back to 2012, took the CPI every year and said, okay, if we had adjusted for inflation every year by 2022, the same amount would have been 380-some thousand. That's where we got that.
Does somebody know where that would be if it was typical inflation? Because most of that inflation was the past couple of years.
Right, the past 2 years, I think it was 5 something, 2 years ago, and, yeah.
So, yeah. The only other question is, what is the definition, like, what definition of CapEx? I've heard it say that CapEx is for things that are, that not existing today. But in my industry, CapEx is for things that are there but are for long range. So, for example, the roof done on a building here, it isn't something done annually, because we don't need a roof, and something you put away in capital.
That's what we put in reserves, that's part of our reserves.
So that's a really good question, Chris, because there's a distinct difference between our reserves, which come out of your dues every year. So just as an example, if the roof cost X amount of dollars and its useful life was 30 years, we're accumulating money in the reserve fund so that after that 30 years is done, we have money to change the roof without having to make assessments. So that's the reserve fund. And that's where we're saying it's existing stuff. When Kevin has golf course equipment that exists, we have reserves to replace those things. But a perfect example, I think it was a couple of years ago, he was borrowing a piece of equipment from other clubs that he couldn't borrow anymore, and we had to buy it. It was $250,000. It exhausted our capital expenditures for that year almost entirely. It's an example of why you really need more. It was just one item that pretty much did it. But it was a non-existing thing. It was an extra piece of equipment that hadn't been reserved.
Okay, thanks.
Okay?
You had your hand, yes, go
I
ahead.
have one question for clarification.
Okay,
And it is about the, club common areas,
okay,
which has a $300,000 limit. And then cleaning up the wording, you're saying potentially there was an additional 300,000 that could have been spent on golf common
Oh.
areas. So you're
yeah,
trying-
that's in the existing.
Right, so you're trying to remove that ambiguity
That's correct.
about
Yes, that's
spending
correct.
600,000.
Right, correct.
And in one.
Because that term was never defined, so I don't think the board ever used that.
So potentially you were, because of the wording, the ambiguity, potentially you had 600,000 a year and now you're reducing it to 4.
If this is passed.
Tiny, or, well, 3.
So are you a marketing person?
Yeah,
We never budgeted.
Oh, right, so
We never budgeted, okay, for that extra 3, but that was there. Okay.
it was possible. So this is a very positive change.
Yeah.
Yeah, we think so.
Okay.
Any further?
any other questions before we move along? Yes, go ahead.
And I'm all for the concept. And I understand the need to try to tie increases to the CPI. What concerns me is not the amount of money, but rather the authority that gets vested in a very few number of people that may have the money and the will to create a capital expenditure that's in contradiction to the community's desires. Because you could do that without a community vote. So it's not the money that bothers me, it's the authority to spend the money on a capital expenditure that the community may not have approved.
Well, for one thing, I would say the board tries to be guided by our key strategic initiatives and our 5-year strategic plan. And that's all predicated on the membership survey that has been done, and there's talk of doing focus groups and things like that too. So that's where it's coming from. All, the members are saying, this is what we want. And I take that back. It's not all coming from that.
That's what I'm looking for, it's where are the checks and balances to contain that authority of a few number of people to create an expenditure.
It's the same as it is today.
Yeah,
There's no difference between tomorrow and today.
except the
So
amount.
the situation that exists today is the same, and the trust you have in the board should be the same as it
I
has.
fully understand the concept is the same. The amount grows exponentially and therefore the purchases can be considerably different in defiance of the community, perhaps. I'm not saying it is, but independent of the community support.
As it is now.
But
That's possible.
it,
That could possibly happen. And the money would be there to do that for large projects that may not have been approved.
As it is now.
but if the total aggregate spending of a project gets to be over 400,000, which is not a very large amount if you're talking about building something. I mean, commercial type buildings are expensive. So if you're talking about 400,000 aggregate, you're not going to build anything more than, say, a big shed or something like that for 400,000. You're not going to be able to build a new wellness
But
center.
that's, I agree, that's 400,000 this year, and then it grows exponentially.
But we still couldn't, all right, I mean, maybe if we built a third of the building every year or something, 400 this year, 400 next year, 400, but I don't think that that's a realistic expectation. Any kind of project that's going to be, over 400,000 needs to go for a membership vote. But the point I was going to make also about, not coming from the members' wants and wishes. Some of the items that we've talked about are coming requests from management because management needs the tools to run this club the way we expect. Right? Kevin needs equipment so you can go out there and enjoy the beautiful golf course that we've got. The accounting department needs software to, depreciate things the correct way. There are things that you might not ever think about and never in a million years ask for, but that's going to be part of the capital expenditure budget if it is needed.
Mrs. Presser, could I add one thing? To your point, sir, we're right, that sounds like the board has all of that authority, but there are checks and balances in place all the way along. The board gets the capital requests from committee members, and management. It has to be vetted by long-range planning and finance committee and management before it ever makes it to the board. So there are checks and balances the whole way through.
The only thing I'm suggesting, and I'm going to vote for it. I'm in favor of raising the limit. I'm torn because we don't have a check and balance that at some level, some threshold, it has to go to a community vote. I don't mind having the fund increase. I don't mind having the automatic inflation. What I mind is there is no checks and balance to say that at some point the community has to support the expenditure.
That's the way it is today with the 300,000. And I think that's the point Gary was trying to make too, is that, and I say it all the time, but I will say it again. We're members on the board too. We have to pay these things just like you guys. I think that's part of the check and balance as well. But you're giving us as an organization the opportunity to spend $300,000 a year on stuff that doesn't exist that's going to make your lives better in Heritage Bay. What we're saying today is it's getting harder and harder and harder for us to do that because things are getting more and more expensive. So we're really just asking for that increase so that we can continue to supply a quality product, a competitive product in Southwest Florida, without having to go through special requests for the membership that are costly. And it's just a matter of maintaining the quality of our lifestyle. And as things get more expensive, we want to be able to operate the way we have in the past.
Go ahead.
One of our check and balances, who you vote for on the board. Right?
Go ahead, Jen.
That's our check and balance is, make sure you make an educated vote when you vote for members of the board.
Thank you. Go ahead, Jen.
Bit of a process question maybe on 2C. So if the board decides by resolution not to increase, based upon the CPI for
They would
fine. They may not do it, they don't have a resolution, they don't do it. Let's say they don't do it for 5 years, for 6 years. Year 7, they come back and they say, okay, we want to increase. It seems the way it's written, it says the CPI in that year is all you get.
That's how I would
Or
word
you
it.
can go back to the previous 6 years of inflation and accumulate that inflation change from year 1 today the year 7 when you decide to have a resolution.
Mine, you know, I'm not a lawyer, but it says each annual budget, so I would read that the board is constrained to the CPI for 1 year, but maybe a lawyer should take a look at that. That's how I
It
would
seems
read
to
it.
me is that it's in that year, the way it's written right now. Can't go back for 5 years or 6, like you did in your analysis. You went back to 10 years and said, we need for 80K, so we're gonna make it 400. It looks like the way the 2C is written, it's just, I can increase it for the CPI increase in that year.
Well, don't forget, that calculation is taken into account when we're doing the budget. And the budget requests come in for capital in June, early June, July, August, and they're vetted out by the finance committee all the way through. The number that you're gonna come up with, obviously, is gonna be from the previous, and it's approved in November. Budget is approved in November. So it's gotta be the previous year's, okay, CPI, what is, and if the proposal is approved, then that number goes in and says, okay, our new capital limit is, presume $300,000, okay, plus 2%. Doesn't mean we're gonna spend all of it. That's just saying, that's your new limit, okay? And again, we have to do what everybody else does. If we get $400,000 worth of requests for management, okay, for all sorts of new equipment in the kitchen, new equipment in Kevin's area, new golf equipment or something like that, we just have to cut that down. We have to cut it down to whatever that limit is, okay, in the budget. That's how it works. And to Bob's question earlier about that limit for capital is approved in the budget in November for the upcoming year. Anything over that, okay, has to be approved by the members. That number.
Any other questions? I know it's gone on quite a long time. Okay. If you come up with any more, we do have, the website where I believe they can submit questions, can't they, on your vote page
Yeah,
or
there's
not?
actually a comment portal on that webpage, but my email address is on there, so direct them to me and I'll tell you to the committee for you.
Yeah, and so check back on that, the FAQ page on the website. We, could possibly be adding some questions and answers based on today, or possibly the town hall next Friday, or other questions might come in, through the office. We'll add them as they come in.
Okay, our final one we're going to discuss today is community-wide voting. Community-wide voting, in this case, is explained here. The reason for this recommendation was that because all non-elected directors present equally equally the 1,250 members of the club, proposed amendment provides an opportunity for all 1,250 units members to vote for each of the 9 director seats while maintaining the equal representation of 2 elected homeowners from each of the 4 housing types. Coach homes, single family homes, terraces, and verandas, plus the athletic. We're not expanding the board, not contracting the board. What we're doing here is providing a right to the owners now to vote for all of the candidates. This is the actual statements, okay, in our board. In our documents right now. We have changed the term voting group to housing group. Because what will happen today, where this is approved, housing group, okay, is primarily defines where the directors will emanate from. Owners, okay, and members are not restricted to only voting for the directors in their housing district. Right now, you have, this is a breakdown of housing groups in Heritage Bay. You have 450 living units in the terraces. You have, it's page 364 verandas. You have 184 units in coach homes. And you have have 252 single-family homes. The terminology here, okay, is that it removes the terms each voting group. We're talking about, candidates and nominations. And what it will say now is that all 9 directors plus the, vote selection of all 9 directors. It goes on, candidates, again, voting group is eliminated, replacing with housing group. Voting materials, the candidates have a reasonable opportunity to indicate their qualifications to the voting members. Elections by community-wide, pose a bit of an issue. Now, instead of just your neighbors, you're out, opinions to the entire community, which has a right to vote for that if it's a matter is approved. So, what will happen here is the ballots, will be a single ballot, let's call it, for voting for directors. And by the way, typically what happens is you vote for one housing unit director every year and at large every other year. So usually it's either 4 or 5 directors that are elected each year. Balloting, it's different. It would be different. And as I described a minute ago, the balloting now would be community-wide, as it is now for the at-large seat that we have. The county, I don't believe there's any change there as compared to our current system. In the past, we've done all of the counting and collecting in the master. That will obviously continue. Vacancies on the boards, they basically are appointed. If there's vacancies on the board, they are appointed, with candidates or members, from within the housing group, which has the opening. And removal of the, down here is just basically of, the removed voting group. So we have changed on this one is that your current voting method permits members to vote for 1 at-large director and 2 directors that represent each housing group for a total of 9. And members cannot vote for directors that represent other housing groups. The proposed voting method will permit members to vote for all housing group directors in addition to the at-large candidate. And except for at-large seat candidates, all others must come from their respective housing group. So the ballots will have candidates for that, let's presume 1 seat each year for the housing group. And those candidates for housing group plans must be Miranda owners, for example. This started when, during the past year, the board investigated several changes to their documents and investigated and tracked other function ruling and looked at this in a way that looks roughly can we expand to the right to the owners. And they unanimously passed the motion to seek a member vote to approve the proposed amendment to our docs, and so that we can have all directors. The timetable on this one, if this amendment is approved at our upcoming annual meeting here in March, will take effect for the elections that are accompanying the 2024 annual meeting. There's nothing to do with this meeting, this upcoming annual meeting in August for 2024. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Okay, so, I definitely see the upside directionally in terms of where this is going, but, and there you, sorry. I definitely see the upside in terms of directionally where this is going. But with many things, there's a downside. So my question is the downside of this.
Yeah, so.
Okay. I definitely see the upside to this, but with many things there is a downside. So I'm just exploring the downside of this. We are relatively newcomers, 2 years, which we've only owned for 2 years. So many people that have been here from the very beginning have had years and years to get to know the other 1,250 doors in this community. But we could be here basically 1 year, and we're in one of branches, so we've taken the time to get to know our brand neighbors. And it will take much more time to get to know people in single family homes or the charities, etc. So for 2024, for our vote to be meaningful, we need to understand who these other people are, and it takes time to know who they are for our vote to be meaningful. So if this is the direction or the change that is going to come about, how can you help people understand who they are voting for better?
I can answer that question
Okay.
quickly, and I say quickly because I didn't think we were gonna have more than 2 or 3 people here. It's kind of interesting. But if you look at the process that's going on right now for next month's annual meeting, candidates who are running for the board are doing video next week, a little short video that's going to be on the website. We are having a meet the candidates session where you get to meet each candidate that's running. There's breakout sessions after that where you can actually ask questions independently. It's not part of the program. So we have a lot of opportunity to get to meet the people. Conceptually, this change, I think, has more upsides than any downsides, because as a board member, we represent the entire community. We come from a housing group. We can handle questions or concerns from that housing group. But as a board member for Heritage Bay, we represent the entire community. So we believe the entire community should have the opportunity to say who they want representing. But the process itself exists where you get to meet and ask questions and get to know every candidate that's running.
Okay. And I guess I would just suggest that it makes that all the more important, because without having that opportunity, it's basically a blind vote. You don't know who we're voting for in another housing group.
And part of your packet, you'll be getting with your ballot, there will be a candidate information sheet for each candidate that you can read through too.
To your point, we've been doing a lot of what I call upping our game here in the last couple of years, in personnel and the facilities. That's an item, okay, that we'll have to take into consideration. We'll have our communication game to make sure that everyone gets a chance to take understand who the other candidates are. Okay. Any other questions?
I think actually I'm gonna go over here with Nick. My question is, because the terraces are short one person.
Because the terraces are short one person, just had to remove themselves for personal reasons. Are we going to be voting for one person for 1 year and the other person for 2 years? And is that going to be made clear on the ballot?
No, all our terms are 2-year terms that are elected. Any shortened terms for that or resignations by our docs are appointed by the board of directors. So, in coming up shortly, we have one director from the terraces who resigned. The board will ultimately, appoint a replacement for that person who will finish the term of the resignation. Hold on a second.
I think I can probably say it. So who came up with the verbiage for the rules for this new amendment? Where did this come?
This was, an ad hoc committee that was formed last year, I think it was last, season, and culminated with a recommendation to the board in, I believe it was March. And, with several other issues that were assessed, I'll say that. And what happened was, this particular verbiage, was, ultimately approved by the board. So the board, this verbiage you're using today, it was approved by.
From council.
Yeah.
Came from council and approved by the board.
Oh, okay, well, to your point, okay, yes, anything that we put up here has gone through our
That understand, but it was at meeting first, or to do this.
series of meetings.
So, it looks like if everybody represents in a community, you know, on the board represents the community. And you've got more people in terrace, and they get two, and you have less people in single family homes, and they get two, that doesn't seem like it's fair.
Well, the two directors from each housing group was instituted right at Princeton. We converted from Lennar, the original Lennar docks at turnover. We adopted this system of having two per housing group. It was equated similar to senatorial representation that Montana has, the same as New York or California.
As long as everybody is changing things now. Why, and look, I live in a single family home, I happen to have terrace as well, but it's, you know, I'm looking at this and this is, it doesn't seem to be what they're saying. It's not really, yes, each type of housing does get two representatives. But, and did I hear correctly that if you live in one, you can't vote in another, is that correct?
Well, if you live in a housing group, you can run for the board for that housing group. So the candidates must come from the housing groups that they reside for the government.
But they represent all.
They represent them. And which is the reason,
From all.
this was actually, this is a partial, if you want to say this, it is not all at large. What you're proposing is, or asking, I think, is why isn't it 9 votes at large?
Why wouldn't you have the top best 9 people in the community as opposed to those selected who have, you know, some reign in maybe one area of the community?
So Chris, I think during our discussion of changing the document so everybody can vote for everybody, we also had conversation about different housing groups potentially having different priorities. And so we wanted to make sure that each housing group had specific representation. Our decision was to just leave it at 2 per housing group and 1 at large, because that's the way the documents were already, rather than just eliminating it where you might end up with 9 single-family home people and nobody coming from any other housing group.
But
So
it almost reads exactly what it said. There's almost
No, what that is now is this
You're still.
extends the right, it extends the right for you as a homeowner to vote for any of the other candidates from other housing. It's not the same as it is today. Granted, okay, it is still a situation here where you still have 2 from each, okay? And that's sort of the part.
So the bottom line is that your point is taken, but the documents, the way we have them written, the way we're proposing them to be changed, and what you're going to have to vote on is limited to this verbiage. When, you know, I don't think we're in a position today to discuss changing the philosophy of how we're bringing board members onto the board.
But as far as like,
So we're maintaining 2 board members from each housing group and 1 at large. That's not changing. And the change is that you would be allowed now to vote for every housing group, every member that's running. I don't think that we should be discussing philosophically why we did that. This is the way it's going to be presented to you to vote.
So, okay, so this is really a meeting about what you're gonna have in front of you, not this is your.
That's correct. That's correct. That's correct.
Any other questions?
I don't have a problem with the voting. I think that's a right direction to go. But the verbiage that the ad hoc committee and that it was discussed during that presentation almost a year ago is incorrect. It says equal representation. If you take exactly what Chris was talking about, you have 3 times the number of people in a terrace that you do have in a coach house. If you take the terraces and the verandas, that's over 65%, over 2/3 of the residents versus a single family. I like the idea of having, but you know, when you say you have equal representation, then why wouldn't
It's
terraces?
equal representation per housing group. Like I'm saying, this is,
It's not perfect. I didn't say it wasn't perfect, but I said it is not stated correctly on the words. I like the 100% voting across the board. But, you know, the terraces, if you take equal representation,
it's equal
would get
representation per housing group.
it's equal
It's 2 members
representation.
in each housing group. It has nothing.
You're putting the words to the back end. It's not represent for each housing group. It's representative across the board. You had the opportunity, and that was presented almost a year ago, to have an equal representation. The one thing was brought up at the meeting was, why would we want terraces? Because that's where most of the renters and most of the investors are at. We don't want them controlling what's going on. That's the information a lot of people presented. That's why they wanted to keep the unequal representation exactly like it is, that we were given from Lennar, instead of making a meaningful change to actual the number of people.
Bob, I'll reiterate again that this is equal representation per housing group. It's not saying how many people are in each group. We have 4 housing groups, 4 housing types. There are 2 board members per housing type. That's the equal representation. It has nothing to do with how many people live in those units. That's the way the documents are written. That's the way the documents always were. And that's what you're going to be voting on. We're not changing that verbiage. Not changing that verbiage now.
Go back to the terrace.
The plan here basically is to revise the docs, place them right that you did not have before, okay? But at the same time, not to disrupt and totally redesign, okay, the voting district, if you want to call it that, out at the end. Any other questions about these proposals? Okay. Then I have to remind you, your vote. And I think the best person to describe this to you is, Stephanie. Stephanie, could you explain, okay, how, these are going to evolve and the ballots are going to evolve and the new voting, the electronic voting? Because, you know, not everyone is, what is voting electronically, right? I think we're in a good state on that one, but not as well as we want to. Correct on the electronic vote.
Yeah, thank you. So first, we're touching on the Your Vote page, which is where the FAQs have been started and will continue based on today's information and information from next week. So there are FAQs, the actual ballots, so that you can get familiar with what they're going to look like.
So that's the Your Vote page on the website. It's one of the main pages, and we'll fill in that information. We'll keep it up to date, but it's your best source of information right now. In addition,
Mr. Boswell was touching on, electronic voting. So we will mail paper ballots to anyone who has not registered for electronic voting, but it is very simple to register. You get an email with all of the information that you would get in the mail, and you just get to click your little boxes and vote in it. Any questions?
Thank you all for coming on a Friday afternoon. A great turnout. Thank you all very much.